What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some new details about the upcoming title Divinity from Larian Studios following their recent AMA over on Reddit, which gave us a whole bunch of new information, but also more specifically addressed the stuff about generative AI after that stuff sort of blew up online following some interviews after the initial announcement. And we'll get into all that shortly here, but first, it's important to understand that this AMA was wide-reaching, and to that end, it should be linked down in the description below. There is actually a lot of questions that were more general to the studio and things that were answered, but this video is focused on the stuff that was about Divinity specifically, or at least relates to Divinity in some way. And so questions that were irrelevant or purely about Baldur's Gate 3 and did not inform Divinity in some way are not things I am including here. And to that end, this is basically a highlights video where I'm trying to condense that down into as palatable a plate as possible, let's say. But keep in mind there was a lot more. And on top of that, you can probably just watch the video if you would prefer. I'm not going to be throwing up like screen captures or things like that on screen, so certainly be advised there. However, that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive into the answers and the new details here and everything we've got going on. And obviously the first thing we're going to tackle is, of course, the stuff about the AI usage. To give a little bit of background here, during an interview, Swin, the studio head, basically mentioned that they had been using AI in things like concept art and exploring possibilities. And while some of that was taken a bit out of context, people did have some legitimate concerns there that needed to be addressed. And then following that, in what I can only describe as like a textbook PR move, they basically said, hey, give us a few weeks through the holidays and we will host this AMA to, of course, address all these things. And I say this is a textbook PR move because this is exactly what you do in those situations. You basically give yourself distance from the actual event to let some of the hot air out of the room. And then ideally, you follow up with a crafted statement that has been worked on in the meantime. That, if it at least addresses people's concerns properly, should alleviate most of the issue. Very, very common response to this stuff, truth be told. However, what does that actually mean for the generative AI? Well, we basically have two responses to this, one from Swin specifically and another from the art director. But in the case of Divinity specifically, they have committed to there not being any generative AI art in Divinity specifically. What's more, they are not going to be using those tools to craft things like concept art, so there can be no discussion about the origin of that art and how it was produced not being, human-made, basically. However, and this is an important however, what they are still doing is working with AI to try to figure out which parts of production they can speed up as a studio, not for Divinity specifically, because most of this stuff is still in the works. That is to say, these things are not actively a part of the production pipeline, so to speak. Basically, their plan is to not try to use any of it to create creative assets. That is to say, the actual art part of it. However, if they were to do that, they would use a GenAI model that is purely trained on their own data. Now, some other examples provided by Alina, the art director again, were that they were experimenting with using AI for like data cleanup on things like, for instance, motion capture that was done, and then they can take that original motion capture and again tighten some of that stuff up, or rapidly tweak the animations in the final product so they don't necessarily have to recapture it, I would imagine. So long story short, there will be no generative AI art in Divinity, but Larian as a studio, as is the case with I would say just about every other company at the moment, is still experimenting with AI in its various forms to see where they can implement it in their production pipeline for the sake of purely being more efficient in terms of iterating on ideas and workflows. They did say a little more in a couple of other places, such as, for example, talking about how they have seemingly committed to not using it for voice capture in any capacity. Even on the experimenting side of things, they don't seem to have any interest in messing with that at all. So there is some other stuff, and if you're looking for something more specific, you may want to read through their answers yourself for that one. Now, speaking for myself and my own opinion on the matter, honestly, I appreciate the transparency. They are being incredibly specific about what they are trying, the things they are doing with it, and I think that's good for a variety of reasons, not least of which is simply informing the public a little bit about what it actually is versus what they potentially think that it is. So, as stated in their AMA, I'm good with this, but mostly I just appreciate the level of transparency they've given here so people can decide if that's alright with them individually. Now, with all of that part out of the way, let's actually dive into the rest of the information and answers we got here, as there is a fair bit to go over and it's going to be relatively rapid fire. So first and foremost, they were asked if they took any notes on things like mods and stuff like that people were making to integrate into further games, and they answered that they paid special attention to UI and appearance mods, and in particular they mentioned trying to flesh out the character creation in particular, as that's always something people are really taken with, and they were paying special attention to what people were doing with that in Baldur's Gate 3 for ideas in terms of Divinity, of course. It was mentioned that initially after BG3 they said that their next game would be smaller, and then now suddenly this game is going to be their biggest project ever, and what the deal with that was, and basically the response there was that when they initially thought they were going to be doing something else in the D&D universe, they wanted that to be a bit smaller, but now that they're focusing on their own projects and stuff, that has obviously gone away, and now they're trying to aim to be a bit bigger. And speaking of Baldur's Gate 3, and this will actually lean into a different question, but they were asked about the limitations that they had with that game, and if there was anything in particular that they couldn't do there because of some limiting factor. And according to them, that was basically just 5th edition. And the reason I bring that up specifically is because somebody else asked a great question about essentially the new rule set that was mentioned as part of an interview previously. It was mentioned that they had done something different here compared to DOS 2 or Baldur's Gate 3. And they went on to explain basically that their idea was to take a look at Divinity Original Sin 2, everything they learned from Baldur's Gate 3, and come up with something entirely new in terms of like action economy and progression. And while we don't have exact details of that, a couple of things were especially interesting to me there, because they mentioned talking about the people who had played Baldur's Gate 3 with the announcement of this new game suddenly going back and playing like Divinity Original Sin 2, and then they've been taking in a lot of feedback from those people in particular and kind of rounding some of that up, as they are still obviously working on that kind of thing. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that they talked about this rule set being designed for video games specifically, whereas 5th edition kind of isn't. But that said, given how well I think they implemented 5th edition into Baldur's Gate 3 and everything they did there in terms of reactivity, that actually does have me pretty excited for whatever they cook up here. And before somebody inevitably asks, they have already said that they are not going to do like the magic armor system from Divinity Original Sin 2 as an example. They obviously said there will be some means of protecting yourself, but the specific physical magic armor system from that game is not something that they will be nailing down. Now, if you couldn't tell by that description, it was already confirmed a couple weeks ago actually that the game is going to be a turn-based CRPG, just in case you had not heard that anywhere, and so that obviously informs a few other details here. They were asked about the camera. Basically their goal here is for something similar to Baldur's Gate 3, but obviously the specifics of that will adjust to whatever the game happens to need, which gives us an opportunity to talk about some other questions that were asked, such as they do not know when they will be showing gameplay just yet, but obviously that's coming. They are shooting for an early access, ideally, so, probably within the next couple of years, I would imagine, hopefully by 2027 at the latest, so we'll be able to see some of that in motion for ourselves, but there is some stuff they're already working on, so people may or may not be aware of this, depending on, I guess, how many games you've played, but Baldur's Gate 3 actually did a lot for turn-based. Not just like, its popularity, mind you, turn-based is pretty in vogue at the moment, but what I'm actually referring to is that Baldur's Gate 3, whether you realize it or not, actually does a lot of stuff behind the scenes to make turn-based feel faster. Some of this is more obvious stuff, like grouping up smaller similar enemies to all act at the same time, but a lot of it is less obvious, the stuff behind the scenes, like, for instance, if you attack and your turn's about to end, when that turn actually ends behind the scenes, so the game starts switching over to a new character, and optimizing that even down to like milliseconds is the kind of thing they've been working on, and they plan to continue that work with the upcoming Divinity title. So while it's a little hard to get into details at the moment, one of the questions they answered was that they are continuing a lot of that behind the scenes work to make turn-based, again, as efficient as it can possibly be. And while I realize this is not necessarily a particularly exciting subject to a lot of people, just knowing how much work they put into Baldur's Gate 3's turn-based turn-based and how much, as somebody who plays a lot of turn-based games, you could really feel it there. I'm hoping that they actually managed to do some really cool stuff here, but we'll see what happens. Speaking of some gameplay systems, so they were asked about Playable Races. They obviously said it was way too soon to talk about that, but the trailer would certainly give you some hints, and that is most notable probably for the orcs. Orcs are given a lot of different approaches across the series. They are typically enemies. You will occasionally find one or two that you could actually talk to, but for the most part, it's a no-go. However, it looks in all likelihood that they're at least shooting currently for them to be playable, but again, no hard confirmation on that just yet. They were asked about co-op and multiplayer. They're obviously shooting for that, hopefully for release, obviously. Still working on it a bit, but that is their goal. They were asked about mod tools. The answer is it is, again, very early, and they don't have the specifics of that, but yes, they obviously want people to be able to mod it. Speaking of modding, if you were wondering, the game itself is going to continue to use their internal Divinity Engine, though obviously they continue to iterate and improve that engine as they go, so this one should be their 5th, I believe, iteration of the Divinity Engine. So there's that. Now, some slightly related questions. Now, in terms of like gameplay mechanics and the like, we have things like, for instance, resting. Someone was asked if there would be anything like a resting system, and while they committed to giving a player space that is dedicated to downtime and player conversations with companions and the like, having to rest in the sense of how D&D forces you to rest to deal with things like refreshing spell slots and the like, that will not be necessary. So we know at least that their new rule set is not going to include that type of thing, but you will likely still have a player space associated with something akin to a camp, which may well be the type of place that you can handle a lot of your loot. So they were asked about loot. This is an important question because while Baldur's Gate 3 had basically all the stuff handcrafted, most of the loot in Divinity Original Sin 2 was actually randomly generated, so to speak. That is to say, it would roll up the item based on some qualifiers when you picked up the item, and that led to a lot of, I would say, oddities with Original Sin 2's loot system that took some getting used to, and basically they said that they seem to have had better success with handcrafting the magic items with things like Baldur's Gate 3, and they plan to do the same type of thing for Divinity. Now, inevitably, to get some of those items, you're going to have to do some exploration. Now, they were asked about some new things that they wanted to add to previous games that they could finally do here, and while it was not directly confirmed, they seem to have hinted at swimming being a thing. They mentioned that a lot of their games start on like a beach, that kind of thing, of course, and that something was always staring you in the face right there, and the obvious mechanic it seems like they're mentioning is that there would be some sort of water exploration. Again, that is not confirmed, it just seems to be the subtext of what their response implied. Speaking of the story, this was already confirmed in multiple places, but just in case you haven't heard it, they did respond to a question about the story and the universe. In particular, this new Divinity game will be a standalone story in the sense that you don't need to have played the other Divinity games to have played this, which was always going to be a given. However, this is not a reboot to the Divinity universe. It will take place in the same continuity, which means things like my own lore videos, etc., that I have put a lot of work into over the years, will still be as accurate as they always were. That is fantastic news. I shouldn't need to update too much there. However, one thing I really wanted to hone in on in their response to this question actually was that they mentioned that they've brought on an entire storytelling team, basically, whose job it is to make the lore consistent with what they are doing. That is fantastic news because as someone who has spent a lot of time covering Divinity lore, it's always been a bit of a mess, and it looks like they are taking significant steps towards making it more coherent and consistent across all of their games and things. Long story short, really happy to see that they are continuing that trend of taking the lore more seriously with the more recent Divinity games. But moving on to the last couple of questions that I want to cover here, they talked about the things they wanted to improve in comparison to things like Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of like narrative and storytelling, and they really wanted to hone in on relationships there. Characters talking more and more with each other, having a lot of dialogue back and forth, things like that, and basically just their overall approach to these things. And while that's a little hard to get into without actually providing details and seeing it in motion, of course, I think the obvious things like the changes to Will as a character and how some of those things didn't pan out, some of the ways they changed Shadowheart over the course of early access, as an example, could be things you could look to in terms of what they plan on changing or improving. But mostly, I just wanted to point out that it's something they seem to be pouring a lot of energy and thought into in terms of the upcoming game's companions, which seem to have, at least as a concept, have already been sort of developed behind the scenes. But again, they're not ready to talk about all that yet. Third from the end here, we then had a question about save scumming and if they're doing anything to prevent that kind of thing. This was a huge conversation around the release of Baldur's Gate 3 because basically you could save at any time and save scum basically any role you wanted to, and as a result, they're always trying to make things like failure with those roles interesting. And even in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, I actually think their honor mode in particular did a really great job of exactly that, actually. So long story short, they plan on continuing to try to encourage people to not save scum through the use of just like interesting things happening and that being a rewarding experience in and of itself, but that obviously save scumming would still be a thing that they're going to let you do. And then the last couple questions were actually about their trailer that I wanted to mention. So somebody asked about the tone of the game, given the tone of the trailer was kind of gross and not something I can even show you on YouTube, but you know, was a really great trailer still. And unsurprisingly, they said that it would be a little more grounded than some of their other games, and that things like folk horror were definitely like a big theme in parts of the game. However, like pretty much any game, that's not the only thing. And they still will try to introduce things like humor, etc. And I wanted to call this one out in particular because I feel like with that trailer in particular, people seem to just be forgetting the initial announcement trailer for Baldur's Gate 3 was like this super gross body horror trailer of someone turning into a mind flayer. So the idea that this trailer that they presented Divinity with was like out of the norm for them is just not true. That's definitely something they've done previously, literally with their prior game. To that end, though, another question was asked about, if they thought the trailer was too much, and generally the answer was no. For the most part, they were enjoying making it and thought it would set the tone, of course, for the things they want to set up appropriately. And for the game they wanted to make, they felt it was the way to go, and again, enjoyed making it. So that is just about, I would say, all of the important or interesting questions here. There are some more, and again, I should have it linked below if you want to go over it and read some of these answers for yourself, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I thought this was great. A lot of interesting information there, and it was nice to get some clarification and direct influences from Larian themselves, and to that end, I thought this was pretty great myself. But obviously, I assume you guys have your own questions and things like that, so I'll turn it over to you. By all means, let me know what you thought about this down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.